Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we quite literally interrupted our normally planned session for this program on the recent developments taking place between the United States and Russia within the context of the war in Ukraine. Just to bring everybody up to speed on what is happening, on Sunday, just a few days ago, President Biden approved Ukraine using long-range missiles empowered by a U.S. guidance system and technical support to strike inside Russia. This had been termed, I would say, by Vladimir Putin and the Russians as a red line, because as the Russians rightly pointed out, it's one thing for the Ukrainians and the Russians to be fighting against one another. It's another thing for the United States to program and satellite direct long-range missiles shot from Ukraine into Russia, because this would make the United States and any NATO allies which participated in the program to be co-combatants in the war. And this would dramatically escalate the situation toward a potential nuclear exchange and possible world war. The Pentagon, as it turned out, advised against this approval. President Biden, nevertheless, proceeded. And now today, we have heard on the news just a few hours ago that Ukraine shot 6 ATACMS missiles in conjunction with U.S. technical support and personnel support into Russia. Apparently, 5 of the 6 were shot down. The 6th one managed to hit an arms depot inside the Russian borders. At the same time, the Kremlin has issued a refined nuclear doctrine stating that for the first time, Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons against attacks, including conventional attacks, conventional weapons attacks, if empowered by the co-combatants that are currently operating inside Ukraine and attacking Russia. So we are as close to a nuclear exchange as certainly we've been in our lifetime. According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, we're the closest we've ever been since the beginning of the atomic clock back in the late 1940s, early 50s, 90 seconds to midnight. And I would guess that with the latest escalation by President Biden, we're moving to 60 seconds, maybe 45 seconds to midnight. So this is a critical moment in the global geostrategic balance of power. It's a critical moment in the ongoing war in Ukraine, which has just marked its 1,000th day of combat. And to help us understand this, I reached out to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who has been on Humanity Rising once before. He was the chief of staff to General Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State. He was also a special assistant to General Powell when he was at the Pentagon and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served in multiple diplomatic and military positions with a 31-year career in the U.S. Army, during which, in addition to his special assignments, he taught and was either a deputy director or director of the Marine Corps War College and the U.S. Naval War College. So Colonel Wilkerson, I would like to invite you to join us here on Humanity Rising. And I'd like to start with you adding to or correcting anything that I just said to set up this conversation? Obviously, the news is just breaking on multiple fronts. You may have additional insight and information. So please, let's start with how you would describe the event since Sunday's announcement by Joe Biden, culminating in the missile attack today by the Ukrainians.
Certainly. Let me come up into the ether just for a moment because your remarks begged it. I think we're as close to midnight as you can get without actually being there. Let's call it a couple of seconds. There are two really formidable reasons that I say that. The American empire over the last 15 years has disassembled completely disassembled every nuclear weapons treaty that we painstakingly built up during the Cold War, to include the most important one of all, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, because that's what we're talking about in Ukraine. They are the most dangerous weapons. Colin Powell was deputy and then national security advisor to Ronald Reagan when we implemented that treaty. And he said it was the most vital treaty of all because these are the most dangerous weapons of all. And we abrogated that treaty too, and all the rest of them. That's the first point. The second point is we are now, and if you want to talk to an expert on this, Dr. Emeritus Professor at MIT, Dr. Ted Postall, will tell you what we're doing. We're actually building a sophisticated array of warheads that will give us preemptive first strike capabilities, not just against the stockpile in Moscow, which is the largest one, but also against the growing stockpile in China together. So we're building now trillions of dollars worth of more of these heinous weapons and destabilizing the nuclear world even more and moving that second hand closer. As to the events in Ukraine, this is a really complex situation. And Sergei Lavrov, over the last 72 hours, probably the most capable diplomat in the world. Colin Powell and he used to talk on the cell phone all the time. Powell would tell the NSA, "Get out of my business. I'm doing diplomacy. I'm using my cell phone." They monitored him all the time. And Vladimir Putin, who is very circumspect and very, I would say, logical in his remarks, their utterances over the last 48 to 72 hours have indicated that what I'm going to say is probably the case for them as well as us. And here's what I'm going to say. These missiles, including ATACMS, and there are others too, only have about 190-mile range. So they are not going to go into a country of 11 time zones very far. Furthermore, as you indicated in your remarks, and I had confirmation of that just a short time ago, 5, 6 out of the 7, 5 out of the 6, whatever, were shot down. Again, showing how this is not that formidable a threat. It's more political for Joe Biden than it is conventional for the war and for the battlefield. But that said, what Putin has very, very clear in terms you can't mistake. He said that if such missiles as ATACMS and there are others are fired, and these missiles need either satellite guidance, that's us, or they need technicians on the ground to fire them, that's us. And all of these missiles that I've heard we're planning on letting them use, and now they have used, are that. If that happens, he's at war with NATO, not Ukraine. Now, the last time he sort of gave us a hint to this, he shot one of his incredibly fast, I forget exactly what kind it was. I think it was of the Avant-Garde family, but he shot one of the missiles that moves at about 9,000 miles an hour. No one on Earth can shoot that down. That missile has a conventional warhead, but it is so big and so fast that its striking power is the equivalent of a low-yield nuclear weapon. It just doesn't have the radioactivity. He shot this particular one a few months ago at the facility in Ukraine, deep in Ukraine, that housed the Swedes, the Norwegians, us, the Brits, the French, and others in a more or less combined training apparatus working with the Ukrainians. And those were the first Swedes to come home in body bags in 100 years because it killed quite a few people in that facility and completely demolished it. Imagine for a moment if you were to target 7 or 8 of those on Kyiv. Imagine if he were to target them on the government building. Imagine if he were to target them on Warsaw, or God forbid, Paris, God forbid any of these, or any other NATO capital. That's exactly what he said was his right under international law, because now these countries are clearly belligerents. He's right, despite the sadness of the news and what might happen if he were to do that. So I think the next step is not necessarily tactical nuclear weapon, because he has, and he's made sure he's been doing this for the last decade, as have we, the capability to respond with devastating effects with what are conventional munitions. By the way, we don't have any way to stop any of these missiles. We, the United States of America, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, now a part of Lockheed Martin, all these wonderful people, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, none of these people can stop these weapons. These weapons are unstoppable. That's really the reason we had the anti-ballistic missile treaty and all the things that went along with it. And we abrogated that, of course. My president did that, George W. Bush, in 2002. So that's where we are. Very dangerous situation, as you pointed out, but still with some maneuver room. And why did Biden do this? That's the huge question. Is it pure politics? Is it spite? Is him trying to involve Trump in a situation that will encumber him so badly that he can't cease the Ukrainian war, which he said he's going to do? Is it all of the above? Knowing Joe Biden over the 29, 30 years I've known him, I'd say there's a lot of spite there, a lot of recrimination there, a lot of take that. You won, but I'm leaving you with a real problem. And of course, he's doing that with regard to Gaza, too, because people say, well, Trump will be terrible. Well, Joe Biden has been terrible. Joe Biden hasn't stopped anything going to the genocide in Gaza. So that's where we are on both these war fronts today. And just one more comment on Ukraine. Yesterday, I learned that the progress of the Russians right now en masse on the Eastern Front is probably 3 to 5 kilometers a day. Mm-hmm. Put your ruler down and see how long Ukraine's going to last. They need to stop this just to have a vestige of their country left.
Yes, for sure. Well, we'll get to those details in a moment, but you covered such a scope. I want to start back with one of the things you said initially about the U.S. nuclear weapons enhancement program. I think it was 2 months ago, the White House announced that it had directed the Pentagon to prepare for a simultaneous first strike against Russia, China, and North Korea, using the enhanced warheads you spoke about on missiles deployed in our submarines. They could get very close to the borders to shorten the flight time, and that was the new nuclear, the tip of the U.S. nuclear spear. And because it seems to me that, as you say, within the context of an abrogation of virtually all the nuclear guardrails, the nuclear protections, particularly the intermediate NUS one, the ABM, et cetera. Tell us a little bit more about how that actually is taking place and the scope of the preparations and where it's fitting into the full spectrum dominance war doctrine, foreign policy doctrine of the United States, because I think the enhancement of the nuclear capacities and the move into Ukraine and the Middle East are not disconnected. It's all part at different dimensions of a single commitment to full spectrum dominance. But speak to that in any way that you would like.
I think you're right. And I think there is a part of this that the American people simply don't understand. And that is the atrophy of our conventional might. You may recall, you're old enough, I think, I know I am, the days in Eisenhower's first and second term when Eisenhower was fighting tooth and nail, really, with General Maxwell Taylor, who later became Kennedy's right-hand man, um, over whether or not Eisenhower's emphasis on nuclear weapons and de-emphasis on conventional forces was smart. Well, Eisenhower knew that we'd had 12 million men and women under arms for World War II, and the American people were not going to tolerate keeping those kinds of forces available. So he did cut significantly. Harry Truman said, when it started, we didn't demobilize, we disintegrated. And there's a lot of truth to that. But Eisenhower picked up on the new, and Eisenhower, you may recall, was the man who fought tooth and nail to internationalize atomic power. The forces that were against him won the day. Many of them were in the Republican Party, and we didn't internationalize it for fear that someone else would build a nuclear weapon. Well, to show you what this fear did, 4 years later, in about 5 days, the Soviets exploded an atomic bomb. So diplomacy was not used, fear was used, the military was used, our possession of nuclear weapons was used, and it lasted 4 years. So first observation of why you don't want to discard diplomacy. The second thing I would say about this history is that we've come back to that now, but we didn't come back to it by choice, except the all-volunteer force was a choice. We decided Americans would not be politically accepting of contingent conscription. We really did it because Dick Nixon wanted to end the protests over Vietnam, but we made an all-volunteer force. Now that force is so expensive and so difficult to recruit for. 50% of the DoD, almost $1 trillion budget goes to people, 50%. And we can't recruit people. We are now, we have two schools going now, one to teach them to pass the entrance exam. They're teaching the test, and the other to force them to lose weight over a 4 to 6 week period so they'll be able to enlist. And tell me how many of those aren't going to go right back. Recidivism amongst weight loss people is really high, to being obese again, if that matters. So that's the desperation we're in right now. So guess how we're going to win a war we fight with Russia or China or any other peer power? By using nuclear weapons. I go back to 1945 and I say, who used nuclear weapons? Ah, the empire did. America, the liberal democracy, it used nuclear weapons. It killed 150,000 or so people in 2 mushroom cloud explosions. We'll do it again. So that's my great fear, is that we have attenuated our conventional might to the point where when we get in with a peer power, think China, think Russia, think China, Russia together, or perhaps even think Iran, and that's another story, we're going to go to nuclear weapons. Not Bibi, not Putin, we are. That's my greatest fear for the commencement of a nuclear holocaust, that America will do it.
Whoa. So what you're saying is that the erosion of U.S. conventional capacity is giving rise to an increasing reliance on nuclear capacity.
Yes.
And that
you named it. It's that capacity, it's all of it, but it's basically that capacity on our ballistic missile submarines, because they're virtually invulnerable and they carry enough atomic weaponry to destroy the world.
Right. Well, you know, let's turn to Ukraine for a moment. Within this context, that one of the surprises, I think, for the Western powers is that virtually none of the weapon systems, sophisticated weapon systems, have actually worked. Each time one has been trotted out, it was going to be the decisive edge for the Ukrainians. And that includes the, ATACMS missiles, for example, that were used, the Patriot missile systems, the various missile systems from UK, France, Germany, the Abrams tank, the Bradley tank, and it appears to be that what's happening in the U.S. conventional forces is not only the erosion of the quality of American people willing to join the Army, but because the actual weaponry is built by a consortium of defense contractors. They're built less for efficacy on the battlefield as much as profit in the banks and spreading the wealth to all the different congressional districts so that there's a domestic agenda for the U.S. conventional warfare capacity, which when deployed on the battlefield basically doesn't work. And the Russians and now the Iranians against the Israelis have shown that they are every bit as sophisticated, if not more sophisticated, than what the U.S. Vaunted military can deploy on the battlefield. What would you agree with that? What would be your comment on that?
I agree with it 100%. And I'll tell you how it happened, the evolution of it, just in a descriptive fashion. We came out of the Vietnam War, and people like Max Thurman and Colin Powell and a host of others decided that our military was a wreck. And they were right. I came out of that war, and we were a wreck. My first rifle company, for example, of 186 men and no women then, I wound up over the course of 14 months of command putting 212 people out of the Army. I mean, on everything from unsuitability to court-martial. That's how bad it was. So Colin and Max and a whole bunch of very smart generals decided that's got to change. Otherwise, the country's in trouble. And over those years, they built up a pretty darn good conventional military with very good equipment because we had lots of defense contractors and they competed with one another. And that competition did what it was supposed to do. It made the products better and made them less expensive. That all came to a head in 1990-91 in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. There's a reason that the U.S. military and many of its allies too performed so superbly in that particular conflict. Not only were they fulfilling the United Nations mandate to kick Saddam's army out of Kuwait, but they also were using the very best equipment and had the very most trained troops in our history, probably. And it was a smashing success, if you will. And George H.W. Bush had the sense not to go to Baghdad, fulfill the UN mandate, come home. Ever since then, we've been falling apart. We're living on that image. We're living on that victory. And we've been losing. Think about it. We've been losing every conflict we've been in since, not necessarily because of the atrophy of the military skills, but because of not understanding the nature of the conflicts and such. But nonetheless, like the Israeli Defense Force, which has been on occupation duty for almost 20 years on October the 7th, it wasn't ready. And not only that, it had some really poor people in its ranks because occupation duty breeds clubbing people with the butt stroke of your rifle. It includes blocking people at checkpoints for no reason whatsoever. It includes rape, pillage, and plunder. And that's what the IDF has been doing for 20 years. Bibi didn't start this on October the 7th. It's been going on at a lesser scale in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in the Golan, in Gaza for a long time. And that atrophies your skills. So long story short, we are not very good today. And the Pentagon knows it. And they don't want a war with Iran, and they don't want a war of any consequence with anyone else until they're able to fix it. And I don't think any of them really want to fix it because what they really want, most of them, the generals, the admirals, is a seven-figure salary from Lockheed Martin or some other defense contractor when they go out the door. And that's what more and more of them are getting. I just appeared before Elizabeth Warren's personnel subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee to talk about the revolving door. These people going out. Let me give you an example. Keith
Tell
Alexander,
us.
Army four-star general, headed up the National Security Agency for 8 years, created some of the programs that violated Americans' rights unquestionably. Keith Alexander. He's now working for Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. Some people tell me he gets a couple of $100,000 a month. Now, I ask you to tell me what you think Keith Alexander is doing for MBS in Riyadh. It ain't good. Yeah, that's the kind of person he is. And Rick Scott, the minority leader, and was going to be, thank God Thune got the job in the Senate apparently, but Rick Scott was vying for it. Rick Scott said to me when the POGO individual, Project on Government Oversight, vice president, as I recall, said to him that description of Keith Alexander, he said, well, it's his due. He served 8 years. It's his due, right? You think that's his due to leave the Pentagon and go right to Saudi Arabia for a 7-8 figure salary and work for one of the bloodiest men on the face of the earth? I mean, he just killed Khashoggi just a few months before that. But that's what we're doing today. And that's kind of, I don't have a lot of trouble with Trump saying, isolated case here, saying that he's going to clean house at the Pentagon. It needs cleaning house. It can't pass an audit. It loses $30-40 billion every year. It can't pass an audit. It's a disaster. But all that to say that none of the people over there are stupid enough to want a conventional war, not even with Iran.
Well, this leads to a question that I'd like to ask you about what appears to be kind of an inverse proportion between kind of declining U.S. military capacity and escalating U.S. aggressiveness in fomenting war. Because if you look at the Biden administration, it was the Biden administration that really drove the war in Ukraine, supporting both genocide and Israeli regionalization of war in the Middle East, escalating tensions with China in Asia around Taiwan, with various generals and think tanks projecting war by 2025, 2026. How do you understand, Larry, that we could be disintegrating on the one hand, the imperial collapse, and escalating our aggressiveness simultaneously? Because that's a recipe for complete and utter disaster.
Bingo. But there is a reason to that madness.
Yeah, tell us.
And what Ukraine and Gaza are proxy wars. That's our new way of doing business. We use other people to fight our wars for us. We use other countries to bleed our enemies. That is probably the strategic purpose, primary purpose of our effort to support Ukraine, to bleed Russia. And through bleeding Russia, as I heard Jake Sullivan say one time, we are the national security advisor. Through bleeding Russia, we're aiming at China because they see that they think Russia will be on our flank and we have to get rid of them. We have to bleed them to the point where they're ineffective and ineffectual, and then we can take on China. I got news for Jake and everyone else up there. What I've just told you is the reason that the only way we're going to fight China successfully is with nuclear weapons, and that success will be Pyrrhic indeed, because what we're going to do is wipe out the world. But that's what we're thinking. Every war game I ever did over Taiwan, and I did a couple over just South China Sea in general, freedom of navigation, that sort of thing, we went nuclear, or the Chinese went nuclear, because we can't fight each other. There's the old, the Princess Bride movie, never fight a land war in Asia. There's a real good reason, because Asia will swallow you. It will swallow you. There are 2.5 million men and 20 million behind them in China. So there's no way you're going to invade. My Marines used to call it the shark and the tiger when they talk about a war over Taiwan. The shark, the United States, can't go ashore, won't go ashore, and the tiger can't come to sea. because he can't swim, or he's restricted by the U.S. fleet. Now, that's not so true anymore because our fleet has shrunk considerably. But still, there is that dimension to it that it'll be air and naval. It will not be on the ground. Well, when the Navy's attrited 30% on both sides, the Air Force is attrited 30% on both sides or greater, and that's in the first 30 days. 100,000 casualties in the first 10 days on both sides. We'll look at each other and we'll say, and I've been in the war games when this happened. What if we put a small yield nuclear weapon on Shanghai? Then they'll get the point. And I'm sure on the other side, they're saying similar things. And then the civilians step in. Dr. Perry, for example, former Secretary of Defense, was playing the president in one of these games, and he just slammed the table. He said, "We're not going there. Game's over." But in the real world, that isn't going to happen probably. When you got 100,000 casualties and the New York Times hasn't carried those kind of casualties on the right side above the fold front page since 1940, 1941 too. So, I mean, the American people are going to demand action, and the president's going to give them action, and we're going to have a nuclear war, and we're going to have started it.
You mentioned Dr. Perry. That's Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, right?
Right. Yeah. Engineer, the only engineer we've ever had in there. And one of the interesting things Dr. Perry told me one time, I was in Korea with him. I was playing the Minister of Defense of the United States, and he was playing the U.S. President. And we had our counterparts from Korea doing the same thing in a political game. And he said, this business about anti-ballistic missiles and such, he said, nowhere in all of engineering history has anybody been able to hit a speeding bullet with a speeding bullet. And so here's what's going to happen if you build these anti-ballistic missile defenses and you think they're going to work. They're going to shoot 10 missiles at you, and the ratio is normally about 2 to 3 out of that 10 will be shot down. But the other 7 are going to get through. What are you going to do when the other 7 get through and have nuclear warheads? This is really stupid to be spending all this money on this sort of thing. Well, to a certain extent, the technology has in some segments, like your statement about the number of ATACMS that were shot down, that requires such an intensity of anti-ballistic missile capability to be successful to that percentage that you really are operating on what we call the negative cost effectiveness line, because what you shot them down with costs a lot more than what was shot. That's
Right,
what
exactly.
that's what the Houthis are doing now. We're shooting their $100,000 missiles down with $2 million missiles. That doesn't work, not for long. But that's where we are now. And you're right, Ukraine has been an incredible battlefield for experimentation and for refutation of a lot of American equipment. A lot of American equipment, from Patriot batteries to ATACMS, not living up to its billing. And I can tell you right now, defense contractors in the United States are really worried because they see Russian, Chinese, and other equipment outstripping theirs. And that's going to get around, and they're going to lose customers, and they know that.
Yeah, yeah. So much to ask you about, but I want to go back to Bill Perry for a moment and ask you. I know you could probably talk for 3 weeks on this, but ask you, starting with, it was Bill Perry that opposed President Clinton's decision to begin the eastward expansion of NATO. And many of us who have studied this matter view that strategic decision,
Yes,
which undermined the previous agreement with Gorbachev not to move NATO 1 inch to the east, as Jim Baker put it, as what really created the momentum that led to the Ukraine war.
yes.
So I'd love to just, since you were so deeply immersed in the military and in the State Department all during that time, share with us, and take your time, because I think it's important for people to understand what's currently happening in this escalation toward nuclear war within the larger context of how the United States actually created the crisis in the first place.
That's a story of stories, in my view. It's a story of euphoria, of joy, of dancing in the aisles, if you will, at the end of the Cold War, when Baker and Edward Shevardnadze, his counterpart, and Gorbachev, Reagan first, then H.W. Bush, Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand were all talking about the end of the Cold War and demonstrating their incredible vision in my mind. All of them, Kohl especially, Gorbachev especially. The Cold War didn't end because we defeated the Soviet Union. The Cold War ended because Gorbachev defeated the Soviet Union. And he did it in a very straightforward way and almost got overthrown by Khrushchev and his own coup mongers before he could do it. But we destroyed, in the agreement that we made, more nuclear warheads than ever before in history. Mm-hmm. We helped the Soviets destroy theirs. We were going from 33,000 warheads on their part and about 28,000 on our part, down to 5,000 in just a few years. We'd gone a lot faster if the lawyers hadn't gotten involved and brought up liability issues, and we had to stop. Powell was furious. He wanted to grab some lawyers and throw them in the sea with anchors around their feet because they were stopping this destruction of the most deadly weapons we'd ever created in human history. What happened? Well, what happened was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton decided to reverse all of that in order to, in my view, and I've taught this for 16 years on 2 campuses, the record is pretty clear, in order to build up his bona fides with regard to security issues, which he felt he was weak in, and he thought Colin Powell was going to be his opponent in the second term. He thought he was going to be running against Colin Powell. It wasn't until 95 that Powell actually went out and said, I'm not running. So he's building up his national security bona fides by convening all these defense contractors to find out if we should expand NATO. And of course, they said, yes, it's a great idea, expand NATO. They wanted to sell F-16s to Warsaw and a whole bunch of. So we did that. Culminate that little brief history in this. George Kennan at 99 years old, Brent Scowcroft, not quite that old, and Henry Kissinger, a little in the middle, came by to see Colin at the last year of his secretariat. And all 3 of them, independently of one another, said the greatest strategic error America had made in the 21st century, besides the invasion of Iraq in 2003, they all said that, was the expansion of NATO.
Yes.
And we would live to regret it deeply. They were right. But you're right, that history was, Helmut Kohl was worried. I remember this vividly. He was worried about putting the 2 Germanys back together again from 2 points of view. He said, my people tell me in your currency, $80 billion. That's the cost. It wound up costing about $150 billion, but that was the staggering cost of reunifying Germany, moving the capital from Bonn to Berlin and so forth. But he was equally worried that if he reunified Germany, that would be a real war starter with Moscow and Gorbachev, even though Gorbachev was talking words of peace at that time. Well, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze together convinced him and convinced H.W. Bush and Baker that that wasn't the case, that as long as NATO didn't expand, everything was copacetic. So Kohl was euphoric at that point, too. And he went ahead with the process, even though he knew it was going to cost him a fortune. And it turned out pretty well. It did cost a fortune, but it turned out pretty well. But then Clinton screwed the pooch. I mean, if one man, and I don't really think one man can be assigned all this negative responsibility, but if one could, it would be Bill Clinton.
Yeah. Yeah. And then subsequent to Bill Clinton, the successive presidents continued the aggressive action.
Yeah. Just one reason I could not bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. I wanted to vote for a woman, but I couldn't vote for Hillary because I knew she was worse than Bill. I'd known her long enough to know she was worse than Bill.
Yeah. Yeah.
in
Yeah.
terms of warmongering.
Right. Right. Exactly. 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 And then, of course, in 2014, the coup against Yanukovych, and recount that story as well for our audience as you understand it, between the so-called Maidan revolution, Maidan coup, the attempts by the Russians to get some kind of conference to talk about general security in Europe, the failure, the special military action. Bring that into relief for us.
I'm not as conversant with that as I was the earlier years, which lead to that. And most of what I know about what you just described is not firsthand the way I know about the early years, because I had two distinct portfolios as chief of staff that had nothing to do with my duties as chief of staff. One of them, a significant one, was North Korea in every dimension. The code word, top secret dimension, as well as the, hey, let's go talk to Yi Gun dimension. I also had that sort of portfolio with regard to Ukraine. So I got a vivid insight into what a corrupt society it was. This is 2002 to 2005. What a corrupt society it was, what an absolutely oligarchical society it had become, as had the Soviets to a certain, or the Russian Soviets turned to Russians to a certain extent. And we were largely responsible for some of that too. For example, Larry Summers and Anatoly Chubai, they orchestrated for Goldman Sachs and others the sell-off at fire sale prices of all of the hard industry of the old Soviet Union to certain oligarchs in Russia, made huge fees off of it for Goldman and other houses, and never got any accountability held for it, because they sort of created the situation in which Yeltsin, incomprehensibly really, walked, because he was an alcoholic par excellence by that time, and then Putin took over to try and fix. So all of that is backdrop for what I saw in Ukraine as one of the most corrupt societies on the face of the earth. And I knew a little history about Ukraine too, about how their partisans, for example, in World War II, had killed everybody, raped every woman who came through, stole every gold nugget from everyone who came. They didn't care who was at war, the Wehrmacht, the Soviet forces, the US forces. They fell on them and ransacked them. This is sort of there was a term that the French used, and it was a very good term. That's so Balkan. Well, they would say that about the Ukrainians too. That's so Balkan. They're Ukraine. That's so Balkan. Because they meant criminals. They meant pure, unadulterated criminals. Odessa. Odessa is the criminal capital of the world next to Tel Aviv. How many people know that? How many people know that Tel Aviv runs narcotic rings, trafficking in people rings, and is probably, as Michiglini has pointed out in his book McMafia, 10% of the $5 to $10 billion, no, I'm sorry, trillion, I get my T's and B's confused sometimes, $1 trillion of black economy every year, led by drugs, illicit traffic in women and things like that, and stolen automobiles. Montenegro, member of NATO, stolen automobile capital of the world. I mean, Albania, trafficking in people, capital of the world. They're members of NATO now. Tell me how they got past the NATO criteria to be members of NATO. Well, they didn't. We waived them. So looking at what happened in Ukraine, I saw people going to Ukraine from the CIA as early as 04 and 05. I saw what we were doing in Georgia happening in Ukraine, what we were doing in Venezuela happening in Ukraine. We don't go in directly as we did in 53 and overthrow Mossadegh in Tehran. We didn't go into Guatemala in 54 and overthrow Jacobo Arbenz. We didn't do that. We went in with NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We went in with soft power, if you will, to teach democracy, to teach all the good things about American liberal democracy, never telling anybody that we're not really a democracy. We're a federal republic with democratic tendencies. But we went in to do this. And guess who those people were infiltrated by? The CIA. And guess what we started doing? We started doing all these color revolutions across the globe to try and overthrow governments. It wasn't Harry Truman going in to stop the communists in 1948 in Italy. It was very subtle, but it was very effective. It used the latest in propaganda techniques. Some of the people who right now are feeding Bibi Netanyahu the lies that he tells every day are the same people. They're the same companies, the same publicists. And this got started in '04 and '05. And then it creeps up to, as you said, this business of General Breedlove, for example, the U.S. Air Force four-star, who was commander of the forces in Europe, the old title Eisenhower had, SACEUR, commanding two forces, the U.S. forces in Europe and all the forces in NATO. He's a big Harley man. So he gets on his Harley and goes down into this area, meets with the Azov battalion, meets with other people like that. He's meeting with CIA operatives that are working with the Azov battalion. And they're all conjuring all these things that are going to happen when Ukraine becomes either a failed state and has to be rescued by NATO, or grows up, if you will, to become a full-fledged NATO member. And remember now, we took Albania, Montenegro. We don't have many criteria for being a member of NATO. So we're going to take the most corrupt state in that region into the heart of NATO because why? Because we can, and because we know it'll make Russia really mad. And this starts the business of we will get provocation, and the provocation will either be because we fomented it in Ukraine and it's going towards Russia, or Russia meeting that provocation starts something. And that's exactly what happened. And that's really going over the Minsk agreement, going over Merkel's admission that we lied, that the whole thing was to get time for Ukraine to rearm, kind of like, Chamberlain's trip. Now historians think Chamberlain's trip to Munich may have been indeed to give the person he knew was going to succeed him, Winston Churchill, time to rearm Britain. And it wasn't such a, sorry thing for Chamberlain to do. He sacrificed himself in order to give Churchill the premiership and time to rebuild Britain's defenses. All of this we were responsible for. I'm not forgiving Putin for crossing international boundaries. It's a war crime to do so. It's an illegal war. We did the same thing in 2003 in Iraq. That was an illegal war. But I don't blame him for doing it because we provoked him to the maximum. And he gave us, during that time period, roughly '05 to 14, and then after 14, he gave us plenty of chances. And the last one, of course, was the famous one where Boris Johnson, for our purposes, intervened. He gave us plenty of chances to cease, to stop, and then to halt the war before it even got started very well. And we intervened and stopped that because we wanted the war. Here's another thing. I have this from people in the Pentagon and also in the intelligence agencies. Even Bill Burns, I think, and I have a lot of respect for Bill Burns, who's now the director of the CIA, should be the Secretary of State. He's so much better than Blinken. But Bill's turned traitor, as far as I'm concerned. Just supporting what he's supporting right now in Ukraine and elsewhere, I have no truck for Bill Burns anymore. But he is a superb diplomat. Bill was caught in the middle, I think, after his very clarifying message that said "niet" means "niet," if you remember. When he says no, when Putin says no, yeah, it means no. And all of a sudden he flipped over and he's been involved with all these things that are happening in Ukraine. And the most heinous thing, then, in my mind, I found out about 6 months ago, Blinken actually helped. I'm told Bill helped the Ukrainians put together a committee that rules on whether or not people's speech, both in Ukraine and outside Ukraine, constitutes an effort to undermine their war effort. They call it terrorism. They can come after people in this country. They can come after people anywhere in Europe. Now, they don't have the assets and they're beleaguered so much right now, they haven't done much of it, but that we participated in helping him Zelensky form a committee that would possibly come after American citizens like me who criticized the whole operation in Ukraine is just, to me, it's as bad as what we did post 9/11 when we just went out and spied on Americans at will. And we haven't stopped a lot of that too. You may know that Scott Ritter was stopped at JFK Airport, Scott being the weapons inspector from the old days. And he asked me, he said, why and what's the wherewithal? Who has this? And I said, Scott, we were in New York together. I said, we still have on the books what we passed during George W. Bush's first administration. And that is the right for any Customs and Border Patrol official within 100 nautical miles of his station, and this means from the border, Mexican border, let's say 100 miles into Texas or New Mexico or whatever, has the right without reasonable suspicion even, certainly doesn't need probable cause, to stop you, take your passport, take your laptop, ship your laptop off to the lab in Colorado, keep your laptop for 30 or 40 days until they're sure you haven't got anything on it that is indicative of criminal activity. Terrorism was what we were looking for. It's still in the books, Scott. It's still in the books. That's probably what Customs and Border Patrol and the State Department backing them up did, because they took his passport and told him he couldn't get on the flight. He was flying to Russia. That's what we still have around, these draconian laws that are lingering, and Congress never takes a law down, or rarely does, actually, unless it's Glass-Steagall under Bill Clinton. The most damage we've ever done to everything FDR created, we just unwound it under Bill Clinton in his attempt to take the Democratic Party closer to the Republicans. Economic attempt, of course. So I mean, it's our fault. It's our fault. John Mearsheimer's absolutely right when he talks about this in detail, that we are the reason Ukraine is going on. And we know it. We know it because we did it on purpose. We did the same thing in Georgia. And we're doing it again in Georgia right now. I'm going on Georgia TV next week. They asked me to come on TV because they said there's no one here telling the truth. I said, you know the truth I'm going to tell, don't you? And she said, yes, that's the reason we want you.
Well, let's just do a little sidebar. A lot is happening in Georgia. It's not very much reported, but take a few minutes and provide your analysis of what's going on, because it's very similar to what happened in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Color revolution.
It's the same template.
U.S. intelligence to disrupt a stable regime.
It's the same template. And I know some of the characters operating and designing that template, because they were military officers who served with me who are now serving in the Ministry of Defense in Georgia. What you do is you infiltrate the country at significant places. And so it's like Charles Koch did in this country with our government and our processes of voting and everything else. You have a lot of people who don't even know what they're doing. They don't know that the ulterior purpose is being designed by Charles up here, the billionaire. And what you're doing is you're a little cog and you're carrying it out. You're a colonel, retired. You're making $300,000 a year, U.S. And you're working in the Georgian MOD and you're pretty comfortable. And it's a great country. And you're there working, and you're working to help the MOD design better policies and procedures for its military and all that stuff. Well, at the same time, all these other people, some of whom are cognizant of what they're doing, they really are operatives for the agency or whatever, and others who are sort of half in and half out, are doing the same thing in every walk of life, from education to healthcare. They're all in there, and they're telling you day after day after day that the best way to become a member of the EU, and therefore very successful, and the best way to have reasonable security and be very successful, is to stay away from that giant up above you. Don't deal with Moscow. Don't deal with Russia. Putin is a dictator. He's a dictator who's looking to take over Tbilisi and everything else, all the countries around you. And you scare them, and you constantly do that. We've been doing that so long, we've got Georgia almost equally divided. We've got, well, I shouldn't say divided, it's almost a threesome. You've got the people who are smart truly smart and fairly well educated who understand what it means to live beside a huge country like Russia and to defy it and to have your helpmate thousands of miles away. And then you got people who really, really think that the line we're feeding them is the best line for their future. They want to be members of the European Union. They want to have NATO membership. They want to be truly European. And these people have all different kinds of motives. Some of them are motivated by the same thing Elon Musk is motivated, and Peter Thiel and Robert Mercer. They want to make big money. And they're being told they can make big money if they turn to the West. And then you have the third who have what you might call not Dalashvili, not Stalin-like connections with Russia, but they have, I would say, blood connections. Even if the blood isn't flowing, they do have those kind of connections. They speak Russian in many cases. And so you've got these groups fighting right now, and they formed mostly 50-50 on the side of we can't defy Russia because otherwise we'll be smothered. We can't leave the EU because otherwise they'll smother us. So you got, and the recent elections we played in. We tried very hard to get the party we wanted to win. We lost again. We lost. So now being so evenly divided, it's like North Carolina, you know. North Carolina is 50-50. They can't hardly escape the problems that creates in North Carolina. Make a Democrat a governor, make a Republican a senator. I mean, they got all kinds of problems. They can't have decent elections because, you know, okay, we're going to cheat because there's only a percentage difference. Well, Georgia's sort of the same way. And in the story, what this woman wants me to talk about is how the United States is fostering all this. This isn't an innocent happening in Georgia.
Exactly. It's being fomented.
Yeah. And lots of money being put into the coffers of those who want to cooperate with the empire.
Yeah. And that's exactly what they did in the couple years leading up to the 2014 Maidan in Ukraine.
Yes.
Destabilization and the exacerbation of tensions toward toppling a regime that wanted neutrality and rapprochement with Russia for someone who would be more compatible with U.S. Aggressive instincts.
You use the word neutrality. In 2005, January 2005, I had a private meeting with Powell. We weren't talking a lot then because I was really irritated at the UN presentation. And I was really irritated at the torture business. And I had discovered that he might have lied to me, that he did know about the high value detainees, HVD program, that Bush had authorized Tenet to run. He did know about the torture of 14 individuals. I'm convinced he did not know anything about Abu Ghraib or any of the other torture, and he was really angry about that because it brought his military into it, and he saw the military being tainted by that. But we weren't talking much, but we did have a conversation about Europe, and I said, watch Ukraine. Watch Ukraine because it's the breadbasket of Europe. You know that when Hitler invaded Russia, he thought, and his food minister told him, that Ukraine was so bountiful that not only would the invasion be a success for the Wehrmacht because it could eat its way all the way to victory, it would be a success for Germany because he saw the submarine warfare was going to really make Germans have to tighten their belts and they would become less supportive of him. So he wanted to feed the German people too. And when he got to Ukraine, of course, the policies that his Wehrmacht used alienated all the people. And besides, Ukrainians don't like Germans anyway. And so, you know, he had real problems with that food. He not only didn't feed the Wehrmacht too well, he couldn't feed the German people very well. So that's the kind of situation you get yourself into. And we've gotten ourselves into that situation around the periphery of the Russians because we don't want the bastards to rise again. I mean, that's the bluntest way I can put it. And they have. Not only have they risen again, their industrial base outstrips ours now in terms of defense material. They could build twice, 3 times, 4 times as fast the implements of war and better implements than we can. So that's what we've done.
Yeah, yeah. So let me just ask you a final question, and thank you so much for all the insights you're providing. So here we sit 2 months before inauguration. Biden has just made his move. There's been the counter move, missiles attack, instability at a higher level. Trump's coming in, I think it's only 60 days.
Yeah.
If you were advising President-elect Donald Trump about Ukraine, what would you tell him? What would be your advice? And the other side of that question is, what do you think, based on what you know, he will do?
Wow. The first part's a lot easier to answer than the second part. Yeah. The first part, I would say, what should he do? And, I've made a thorough study of post-World War II America, and especially in the field of international relations and security relations. There's hardly a president who didn't do this at one time or another. Or a president-elect for that matter, sometimes to nefarious purposes. I would pick up the phone and I would call Vladimir and I would talk to him and I would say, listen, I recognize what you've done. I recognize what you hold. I recognize what you will probably hold when the 20th of January rolls around. Don't expect me to get to it right away, but I will get to it rapidly. And I have no problem with that. I have no problem with your sovereignty over Crimea either. And I really have no problem with your insistence that Ukraine never be a member of NATO, because I always thought that it should be neutral. From there, we can negotiate. So hold your horses until I get there. He's going to keep on his 3 kilometers, whatever, a day and all that. But the Russians have a history at the Dnieper that they don't want to necessarily relive. If you remember, they lost a fortune in weaponry and men at the Dnieper when they tried to cross it when they were fighting Germany. They were advancing and Germany was retreating, but still they took a hell of a toll there. So that memory has to be in there somewhere. The second thing I would do is I would pick up the phone or go see Biden. And I would give him not the same comments, but I would ask him very pointedly to not encumber the incoming president any more than he already has. Put it on hold, what you're doing. If you've got tranches that the Congress is going to send over, we'll see if the Congress approves they're going over, because they very well might not now. But anyway, have a serious conversation with him, see what you could get out of it. And then what I do when I came in is I would be prepared to go to negotiations immediately. I'd have my team already assembled, my principal ready to go. I would have imbued him with the art of the deal. I mean, this is what scares me, because this is supposedly Trump's forte. When this person goes to the table, Putin is going to be insistent on certain things. It's going to look like, if they result in an agreement, a loss for the United States and for NATO. And you're going to have to go into these negotiations with an idea and a concept that I think is highly relevant to diplomacy, more so than its opposite. Its opposite is win-win. Everybody always talks about, you want to go in, you want to win-win. You want to they think they won and you want to think you won. No. He loses and you lose, but you don't lose badly. And politically, it's not a devastating loss. That's the only way you're going to be able to approach this, because it's going to be really tough. I don't know if Trump can do that. I don't know if this man who has preached that he is the art of the deal master can take that kind of thing, where Putin loses a little, he loses a little, but the war stops, the killing stops, the nuclear threat stops, and we get some peace. and we get neutrality for Ukraine, because that's got no NATO membership in 20 years, no NATO membership in 100 years. It's got to be neutrality. It's got to be neutrality. Otherwise, and you may have this anyway, you're going to have a Cyprus. You're going to have a Korea. You're going to have 75, 100 years of a demilitarized zone and forces that are constantly looking at each other across it. And the Ukrainians will violate this all the time because that's who they are. They'll be over there mucking around in the Russian occupied territories or whatever. Maybe if you're really good, if you're really astute at the art of the deal, you could convince him to have referenda in those portions of Ukraine, Eastern Donbass, that are Russian speaking predominantly. You would have referenda in 10 years or so requiring a 55% majority. And those referenda would decide, one, affiliate with Russia, two, affiliate with Kyiv, three, autonomy. And establish something out there that was more or less accepted by at least a sizable majority of the people living there, and live with that. But I don't think it's going to be, Ukraine just doesn't have a history of leaving people alone who are around to be raped, pillaged, or plundered. And for that matter, that portion of Russia doesn't either. So you've got a problem with that, and it's going to be difficult to manage. But what worries me most is Trump will not want to do anything but look like he's thoroughly victorious coming out of the negotiations. He wants to end the war, but he's going to want to end it on his terms, and that worries me.
Mm. Mm. In the end, politics is both perception and psychology.
Yes. Yes.
And we're having a very mercurial psychology about ready to enter the Oval Office of the White House of the United States. And the man who's been in the leadership of Russia for 20 plus years is a psychology of ultimately strategic, unemotional calculation.
Yes.
An extraordinary thinker and planner of Vladimir Putin, and how these two personalities will interact within the context of the current volatility is going to be a very interesting thing indeed.
And Trump's experience with the North Korean leader is not a good sign, because, bellicosity. Oh, now I'm meeting with you and I'm kissing you and all this stuff, and then bellicosity again. And now North Korea is firmly in Moscow's camp now. And I found out yesterday, I'd heard this. I didn't know it was valid, but yesterday I got it pretty solid. Russia has given him essential technology so that his warheads, his nuclear warheads, can now reach any part of the United States.
Whoa.
To include Mar-a-Lago, my friend said.
Whoa. So the North Koreans.
I knew this was coming, because what happened at the end of the Cold War, although Gorbachev tried his best to guard against it, a number of the nuclear scientists from Russia made their way to places like North Korea, Pyongyang, like AQ Khan's network, Tripoli, Libya, and they started very much trying to sell to Gaddafi, to Kim Jong-un then, and to others in the complex of AQ Khan's network, their nuclear knowledge. And we knew they were very much responsible for North Korea moving to a nuclear weapon a lot faster than we thought they could. And it wasn't Gorbachev's fault. He tried to keep them from immigrating, as it were, but some of them did.
Yeah, gotcha. Colonel Wilkerson, everyone. Thank you so much, Colonel. This has been a gold mine of information and I think perspective that enables us to at least understand the predicament that we're in and how we might be able to resolve it given judicious insight on both sides, but I think particularly on the American side, since we're the prime movers in creating the problem, we have to somehow learn to stand down. And I don't know whether we can do that at this point in our historical development, but that's the task at hand.
The history of the empire in general for the past 3,000 years argues against our being able to do that. But maybe we could be the first empire to recognize its mistakes and correct them. I don't know.
Let us hope and pray.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this. We look forward. We'll have you back at the next crisis to give us your insight. So that'll bring us to a close, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You receive the link in your Zoom reminders for today. But that is where we are on this planet of ours at this time. And let us hold the precariousness of our world within the context of all of our deep commitment to peace and well-being. Colonel, thank you.
I'll certainly sign up to that.
Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Take care.